Going over the cultural values. We've got the last two to cover here today. But wanted to, yeah, just check in real quick, see if you guys had run into any situations the last week or so of running into the last two cultural values we covered, um, which were the being versus doing cultures, or the universalism versus particularism cultures. You guys run into any of those or any of the other ones this last week that stood out to you?
I don't know that I had anything that just jumped out at me through the week, but just I appreciate the understanding, kind of that and how we all
Mm,
kind of fit into, I guess, what becomes a priority of what the focus is, So I appreciate you bringing that
mm,
to for us to talk through
yeah.
anyway.
I just got a message from a ministry partner that I've been working with, and um, he's in a culture that is very being oriented, and he comes from a very doing oriented culture, and just
Yeah,
mentioned some difficulties. And I was pretty proud of him. Sound like he canceled the meeting that he was supposed to have had, and to be able to just go take care of his daughter and kind of just let down a little bit, and stop that kind of frenzy. So it was neat to see him being aware of that. And um, yeah, but all right. So the last two cultural values we're going to go over. Um, the next one is the expressive versus non-expressive cultures. Um, it's fairly self-explanatory, but I'm sure you guys are familiar with people or certain cultures that kind of are um, use the American expression deadpan, kind of non-expressive. They don't really necessarily react to things you say, versus the other, maybe some other cultures that are hands waving and, you know, really excited, and lots of verbal confirmation, whether it's a grunt or a, oh yeah, or things like that, that kind of are just constantly kind of that feedback. Um, yeah, and so that's what this specific value addresses. Um, so yeah, can you guys maybe name a very expressive culture that you guys are aware of or have interacted with?
I think like a gospel church is really
Mm,
expressive, like there's a lot of feedback coming from the audience back up
yep,
to it. So
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, the Italians are, I think, known to be one of the most expressive cultures in the world. Just hand movements. I've seen some fun videos of, like people tying Italians' hands behind his back and trying to get him to talk about something. He literally can't get a full sentence out.
yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, but then, Asia typically is a fairly non-expressive culture, so it's really interesting. Would watch people, and someone was getting chewed out in a store, for trying to steal something or something along those lines, and the person kind of just stood there, and it was like, it was fairly soon after we had arrived, and I was very confused. So this person's just like getting chewed out and like getting starting to get shoved, and person just kind of standing there very non-expressive, and then all of a sudden, this person snapped and just went ballistic. And it was kind of a good picture too of, these, um, we're still all human. We still all have the same emotions and feelings
Yeah.
and all of that. Um, but what is culturally appropriate initially, and for that crust, that surface layer, what is the appropriate ways to behave in these different situations? And anger, embarrassment, things they're going to break, that deep-seated emotions are going to break through those at some point, depending on how far they're pushed. So
Yeah.
um, yeah.
So difference in that, Jeremiah, for kind of public versus non-public, or setting, is that if
Yeah, it's a
a culture is non-expressive, are they that way no matter what, or?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So like for the Asian context, it's like parents don't really are not expressive with their love towards their children typically, at least in the context I was in. It's like, you know, well, my parents have never said they love me. Like I wouldn't have a clue what to do if my dad said he loved me. um, that's a common thing in
Yeah.
that context. But at the same time, like you could ask the same person that question, a question of like, well, do you think your parents love you? And they'd be like, oh, well, absolutely. There's no question in their
Yeah.
mind, because they would, you know, expressions of love were, you know, they fed you every meal, and they, you know, went out of their way to cook your favorite meal on your birthday or the weekend, things like that. And so
Yeah.
there's different expressions and interpretations of that. But um, yeah, so it does impact the home life as well. Um, yeah, so.
We saw that. I was in Germany at one point in time doing some work, and it felt like in public, they were a very now that you say this, non-expressive, just didn't really
Mm,
have any eye contact. But if you had a small group or you were in a more quote private setting, then it totally, I don't know, it totally flipped, but it changed pretty dramatically of
mm.
their, engagement in a conversation. And so it was just interesting for that, watching that, with that
Yeah,
group of people.
yeah. Well, you know, and these things, you know, can play out also in, you know, body language of, you know, like yeah, our personal body between with body language, but also with, you know, like personal space. You know,
Yeah.
like you know, here in the States, we kind of like having a little bit of space between us and the person we're talking to, versus other cultures which are very close. There's going to be that bubble, and
Right.
so yeah, and so that can get funny to watch too. I've watched it where, you know, one party is a from a very non, they don't like people being close to them, and the other person was from the complete opposite, and they need to be in your face to have like a passionate conversation with you. And so like the one party would step closer to be close to have that relationship, and then the other party was backing up because it felt so uncomfortable to them, and they were doing a circle around the room because of, you know,
Yeah.
both subconsciously weren't even aware of it. So it's fun, an interesting one to watch. But yeah, so yeah, where would you guys say you would fall on this spectrum, and where would you have you run into issues with this one specifically?
Mm. I'm
I
probably
think
more non-expressive than expressive, and I don't know if that's just that sounds odd because when you say that, it sounds like cold or detached, kind of thing. That's not really what you are, but I'd say I'm more
No, no,
non-expressive than expressive. But again, I'm probably a little different too, whether that's in a group setting or just in a private setting with family or friends or whatever. That changes,
for
for
sure,
me as well.
for sure.
I
Sarah,
think
you were starting to say something?
I think it can
Oh,
be
sorry.
fairly expressive, especially with like facial expressions and
Yeah.
that sort of thing.
Mhm.
But I don't know, like I need a little bit of a personal space bubble, and I'm not like wildly expressive. I'm not going to be incapable of speech if you take my hands away from me or any of that. So yeah, I'm probably somewhere in the middle. Um, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a fun one just to kind of start being aware of, you know, and obviously there's personalities involved with everyone, and, you know, introvert versus extrovert and all that, but it's
Yeah.
fun to start kind of digging down a little bit and figuring out, hey, maybe is this a cultural, for that broader cultural thing that maybe I should take into consideration if I'm, you know, my dad's German, and so rather a little less expressive, and so um, and then, you know, for me going down then to, you know, a Latin country where it's, you know, a lot closer, a lot more animated, it's going to be a little bit difficult and different, and that's going to add to my culture shock. That's going to add to the way I, you know, feel received or heard, those kind of situations. So yeah, so just a good one to be aware of, and it's definitely, I think Sarah, you kind of touched on it, but it's definitely kind of tied to that indirect versus direct communication styles as well. It's going to be tied into that one pretty closely. So um, yeah. Any other thoughts or questions on this specific one? This one's fairly straightforward, but all right. And then our last cultural value is linear versus non-linear. So the linear is going to emphasis on um, focusing on one thing at a time and being able to kind of keep work and home life separate. So it's kind of you're focusing on one thing at a time, and you're going to be kind of working uh, chronologically towards the end goal, versus the non-linear cultures are going to emphasize kind of mixing everything up all at the same time. Work and home life are completely interwound, and it's very common. Well, yeah. Anyway, and so this is one definitely comes out in a lot of different ways. Yeah, there's a couple different emphases we could take on this, but I think typically where we see this is going to be in that kind of separation of work and home life. And so, Sarah, you had mentioned an example, I think it was a few sessions ago, about meeting with someone and just how they talked about family and home life so much in the beginning of a conversation. And that was a perfect example of this, especially because for that person in that culture where they're from, man, family life reflects just as much on your business, work, ministry as anything else. And so it's important. And that's kind of people want to be known and for their whole context, their whole identity, not just their work cubicle, what they get done between 9 and 5. So yeah, can you guys think of any culture, like specific cultures in the world that would be more linear or non-linear, would fall in either of those?
It's interesting. I feel like the pandemic has really had an impact on this to a degree
Hmm.
because so many of us have switched to working from home more often than we used to. And with working from home comes just a different reality. Like Jonathan's mother-in-law stopping by in the last week, or like I've been on a Zoom call for class in my master's program with a British professor who's working at home, and his doorbell rings when he's on the call and he needs to go answer the doorbell. And like, so you get this influx of personal life with what would typically
Hmm.
have been professional probably prior to the pandemic. Like I would picture British culture as maybe being
Yeah.
more linear.
Yeah.
And so I do just think there's been an impact that has shifted culture a little bit in the last couple of
Yeah.
years.
No, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great example. Yeah. And that's, go back to that idea of culture, right? Culture is not a static, hard line in the ground. It's this constantly moving, evolving, changing thing. And so it's not we can't nail it down or put absolutes on it. But it's those best guess practices. Um, but yeah, that's a great example of all of a sudden everyone became aware of the fact that we're all human, right? In the past, we were able to kind of segment, okay, it's my work life. Yeah, maybe be aware of kids' soccer games or whatever, but now it's yeah, fully integrated and, kids walking in on meetings and whatnot. So, yeah, definitely a shift there. I would typically, when you look at, yeah, most Western cultures tend to be a little more linear,
Yeah.
kind of thinking that straight line kind of and segment different aspects of our life. Um, but then you start getting into more Latin, some Asian cultures definitely are going to be more, yeah, non-linear. One thing, example we found, you know, I was raised in a very linear culture, and my theology is very linear as well. And so my theological training background was very linear, high emphasis on talking about, chronological teaching of scriptures and looking at kind of the storyline, this flat line, and then our Asian context was excessively non-linear, as far as in the relationships and thinking in terms of theology. So um, all of a sudden, sharing the gospel with someone who has no foundation, they had heard one thing about Revelation end times, and so that's what they wanted to talk about. And we're like, why would we talk about the end times when like you don't even know like who God the creator is, or some of these like in our mind was like you need to do A, then B, then C, and they were trying to start at Z and then maybe go over to R and then up to B, and so it even really drastically affects storytelling. The Chinese movies are famous for being excessively confusing to Westerners because there's kind of jumping forward 10 years and then jumping back 45 years. And it's just kind of this method of storytelling and narrative that was just completely confusing to me, where I'm going from typical movie, you start with the
Yeah.
origin of the character and all of that, right? And so, yeah, it's a different way and a different perspective, which definitely can change the way that we do ministry, or even try to start a business or things like that. Sarah, you may not maybe run into this in business coaching, where someone's trying to maybe jump ahead a few steps in that business process versus yeah, doing all the legal work first, right, or laying that groundwork. So things just be aware of. There are different, cultural clusters that are more linear versus nonlinear. But yeah, any other personal experience running into these for you guys?
I think Sarah's right on the, kind of what the pandemic has done to, how we work and how we function and how we're okay to function with that has changed businesses itself, how they are thinking of their,
Mm,
their structure, their offices, their, in the Kansas City area, Cerner is a huge employer of, they're in the medical sourcing tracking world, and there's 3 or 4 major building campuses they have around Kansas City. They've built over the last, I don't know, 5 years or 7 years, something like that. 2 or 3 of those are sitting totally empty right now. They've just,
mm,
everybody's at home, or they're less workers or whatever the deal is, but they have these massive buildings that nobody is using right now. So
yeah,
it's just a weird thing how that's come about. So it changes
yeah.
everything in that way. Um, and just for me personally, I was thinking through my old sales world of being a salesman. The guy that kind of trained me in a lot of stuff said, if you skip a step, you skip the sale. Like if you don't do
Mm,
this in this process, you assume and jump ahead, you could wind up. So that's always kind of been my
mm,
nature, like don't skip over because you'll lose track, or you'll assume,
mm.
and that's not what you're supposed to do. But it's a little bit of a different world today that we're working through all of that.
Yeah,
Jeremiah, do
yeah,
you
for sure.
um like linear cultures align with more time oriented cultures as well? And is that a common
Yeah.
thing that you see?
Yeah, this one definitely ties in a lot with that time orientation for sure.
Yeah.
There is, um, uh, man, I remember I had a good example of this, and I don't think I have it written down. Um, but it doesn't necessarily always focus on, on that. Hmm. I'll have to get back to you on that one. It is more tied with that for sure. Just like that, expressive, non-expressive is going to be a little more tied with that not direct versus indirect communication. Um, ah, yeah, I'll
Aren't
have
you
to
going to
get
have
back to you
kind of
on
a
that one. There
natural?
was a
Aren't you going to
specific,
have kind of a natural bent to that? I mean, if you're time oriented, it's going to be more linear. It's going to be more direct communication. Probably be more universalism. I mean, like it's not
yeah,
gonna always be that way, but you're gonna kind of lean more toward each of those kind of falling in line, I would guess.
yeah, yeah. Typically, that would be more tied together. There was one specific culture. I can't remember what it is now, though. It's going to drive me nuts, but that was extremely linear, but was also it's like the opposite of what you would expect, at least for the time orientation, that connection there. So that's, again, there's no hard fast rules, but it is interesting to see, how some of these play out in different cultures. So yeah, so I think there is some ties there generally. And again, that's where it's good to kind of like, hey, I'm seeing some like hardcore emphasis on, step A, then step B, then step C. So maybe I can start being more aware of like, hey, you can try to guess in some of those ways, and use these as that sophisticated stereotypes to kind of dig down a little bit deeper, and try to be a little more intentional, using those different CQ capabilities to plan ahead and plan for better interactions. So yeah.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts on these, either this last one or any of the 10 that we've covered? Any? Yeah.
Mhm.
Let me ask you guys this. Is there one of these cultural values that really stood out to you as just you could relate to, or maybe had aha moments or anything like that really stood out?
I think the one that probably um, hit more to home is just the being versus doing aspect. Just the comparison of
Mm,
those. Just how do I function? And
yeah.
in the fact of wanting to be productive, wanting to be efficient, effective, all that. But how do you
Mm,
do that and not, lose sight of people and relationships? And I talk about it all the time that if we're if it's people or structure, people are more important. But if we don't have, I believe you don't have a good structure, you're not taking care of people. So those things all balance and overlap. Like if we,
for
but that
sure.
that was probably one more so for me.
Mhm. Yeah, I think a lot of the ones that are standing out to me are kind of the ones that were newer ideas to me. Like I've just from being in other cultures know a bit more about the time orientation,
Mm,
and the being versus doing and all of that. But I think new ideas that impact how I might communicate or relate to people in the future with better understanding or more curiosity are like individualism versus collectivism, and
mm,
the cooperative versus competitive, indirect versus direct, and just kind of being aware of my own leanings in those conversations, and how might I, if I know I'm, working with someone who comes from more of a like low high context or low context culture, how can I adapt to potentially provide some more of
yeah.
that allows communication to go more smoothly in those situations. And then I also think about the power dynamics, the high power versus low
Mm,
power,
Yeah.
and not just in like relationship with people and wondering if someone leans more one way or the other and how that might impact how I relate to them, is
yeah.
even just thinking about power dynamics in general as we look at justice issues in the world today,
Mm,
and what might
yeah.
be influenced different actions or different societies' abilities to achieve a greater sense of equality. Power
Mm,
dynamics really to that, and perception of those powers at play.
yeah.
So
Yeah. Absolutely. And that's a hard one, especially that the power stuff, because that messes with a lot of long seated, cultural norms, and whether it's right or wrong, there's a lot of different pieces at play there. And so, um, yeah, when we're trying to look at how to make an impact on whatever community, individual, business, ministry, village, whatever it may be, being able to be aware of, where are they at, and then where am I coming from, and what change are we trying to affect here, and figuring out how to bridge that gap where we're not trying to just get people to come to our way of thinking, because that's never healthy. But we're also not just trying to adapt what this culture that we're entering into already has. And so being able to communicate our ideas and our values, hopefully which are coming from God's word, right? We're trying to find that way of translating into this new culture. Man, it can get real messy real quick, but just being aware of it and making sure that we're, I guess, evaluating our actions, our assumptions, our thoughts in these realms. I found the cultural intelligence stuff is a great tool for that, just to kind of help bring some grids to go through to just make sure we're not getting stuck in those patterns that have caused a lot of damage in this world. So,
Yeah.
but
It's really good.
well, what was that?
Oh, I just said that's really good. I'm really thankful that
Yeah.
you more insight into some of these things over the past few weeks. So thank you, Jeremiah.
Yeah,
Very
my
much so.
pleasure. It's been fun. I've really enjoyed, and I've definitely learned a bunch from you guys here in this. So feel free to reach out if you have any other questions or specific, problems that you are just maybe getting stuck on and can't figure out if it's just a difficult person or a specific issues going beyond that just are hard to sometimes, especially when you're in the moment yourself. It's hard to sometimes have that bigger perspective. So I'm here for you guys if that ever comes up, or for anyone else watching these videos as well. So yeah, well, thanks guys. Hope you have a good rest of your week here, and I think that's it. So
Thanks, Jeremiah. Been great.
all right, thanks guys, take care.
All right. See you, Sarah.
Thanks.
Bye.